Thank you to all of the amazing folks that I've met over the last week from the Friends of Mahalapu who have been such gracious hosts and showing me all over this gorgeous island that I've never been to before. It's very exciting to be here. I'm a Portland, Oregon resident. Especially want to thank Bridget for the extraordinary amount of work she does. I'd like to give her a round of applause for how much work she's doing. I'm a longtime grassroots community organizer and educator in the community rights movement, which you'll know a lot more about in a half an hour after my presentation is completed. It's a very intriguing social movement that started in 1999 in a small conservative family hog farm community in Pennsylvania, which I'll tell you more about in a couple of minutes. It has spread across the United States to 200 communities in 9 states. Communities taking back their authority to exercise their right to govern themselves and protect their own health and welfare. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history and how corporations came to be so powerful. I'm going to talk about the community rights movement as a response to that history, and I'm going to tie it into the dairy farm proposal here. And I'll talk for about a half an hour or so. I want to start with, I start a lot of my talks with this claim. It is we the people, who give the county, Kauai County, the authority to govern, and not the other way around. It is we the people who give the state of Hawaii the authority to govern, and not the other way around. It is we the people of the United States of America who give the federal government the authority to govern, and not the other way around. And the reason that that is that way is because of what happened during and after the American Revolution, when those who were active in the American Revolution made it very clear that life and liberty were going to be established for all people. Unfortunately, in the early days, all people, all persons under law meant white men with property, which was a tiny percentage of us at the time. Fortunately, it means most of us today. But people fought very hard in the American Revolution, not just to create basic democratic structures, but to create those democratic structures locally. And in fact, one of the earliest state constitutions in the United States enshrined the right of local community self-government, and this was fairly common in the first decade after the American Revolution. The first Pennsylvania Constitution was called the Declaration of the Rights of the Inhabitants of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And here's just one paragraph post-American Revolution from the Pennsylvania Constitution: that government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community, and not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single man, family, or set of men who are only part of that community. And that the community has an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish government in such manner as shall be by that community judged most conducive to the public wealth. And that kind of language has continued to this day. There's very little revolutionary language from the American Revolution left in our core documents, but it's there. And one of the places is in the first few paragraphs of every state constitution. It's an American Revolution remnant. And your Constitution begins, Article 1, Bill of Rights, Section 1, Political Power. All political power of this state is inherent in the people, and the responsibility for the exercise thereof rests with the people. All government is founded on this authority. In other words, if there isn't consent of the governed in Hawaii or in any other state in the Union, there isn't legitimate government. Does that make sense? If there isn't consent, your government isn't legitimate. And we've gotten to a point in the United States that there isn't consent on a whole variety of topics. In most communities, there are environmental crises going on. This crisis with the dairy isn't unusual, and I'm sure almost everyone in the room knows that, I mean, many of you probably escaped from other places in the United States and elsewhere where you were escaping other environmental crises or social movement, social justice or economic injustice crises. So we're all, in a way, experts in the United States right now in experiencing a lack of consent of the governed. So I'm going to explain to you what happened in 1999 in this small township of Wells, Pennsylvania. Wells Township, Pennsylvania. 520 folks, mostly small family farm community, mostly hog farms, mostly conservative folks. And this was the birthplace of, we didn't know it at the time, but this was really the beginning of the community rights movement in the United States. And you'll see how this all ties in a few minutes with what you're doing here, your concerns here. In around 1996, the farmers in Wells Township, Pennsylvania, discovered that they were going to be the recipients of a 15,000 head factory farm of hogs coming from a large corporation in the Deep South. It had already filed an application with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And they were not pleased about this proposal. That was not the vision that the farmers had for the future of their community. They didn't want their kids and grandkids having to live in a community with a hog farm of 15,000 hogs. And as you can imagine, just as you're dealing with 2,000 cattle, there's the stench, and there's the concern about the poop and urine ponds overflowing or leaking into creeks or into the ocean. There's the property value drop. There's all sorts of human health concerns. Well, being patriotic farmers, they assumed that there was somewhere they could go in Pennsylvania to say, as a community that was overwhelmingly together on this one, we don't want this factory farm in our community, so could you just deny the application, please? And they assumed, because they understood they were we the people, the sovereign people, which they had learned in civics class, and that government serves us and has duties and responsibilities to us, that there was somewhere they could go to get this to happen. And they talked to the assistant director of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They traveled to this fellow's office, and he welcomed them into his office, and he said, we're working currently on a manure management plan for this application. We'd love for your input on this manure management plan. And the farmers were a little bit stunned because they hadn't really come to talk about a manure management plan. They'd come to say, we want the application denied. And the administrator for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture said, well, that's really not how we operate here. We're a regulatory agency. And the way regulatory agencies operate is that once an application is considered what's called administratively complete, that application is generally approved. So once all of the environmental studies have been attached, or the health studies, or the social whatever studies, and the I's have been dotted and the T's have been crossed, the application is approved. How many people have been to a regulatory hearing of a state or federal agency? That's it? Really? Just a handful of you? Come on, tell me. How many of you have been to a regulatory? It's that small. I'm surprised. It's usually much greater. So the experience that most people have at regulatory hearings, and if you follow the news in the Pacific Northwest where I live, we've been battling oil and coal train proposals through the Northwest now for the last 3 or 4 years. And we've actually stopped 5 of 6 oil and coal train export terminals in the Pacific Northwest in the last couple of years. And it's taken tens and tens of thousands of people showing up at these public hearings and claiming that they're going to do civil disobedience if the public will is ignored. The reason I'm mentioning this situation is that a lot of people who've gone to regulatory hearings have discovered that it doesn't matter whether 90, 95, 98% of the hundreds of people, the thousands of people who attend a regulatory hearing, if they're all on the same side, if they're all saying we don't want this thing in our community, that if the permit is administratively complete, it almost always gets approved. So there's a structural problem with the regulatory system, clearly. And so the movement that I'm part of studied what is the history of the regulatory arena of law that the regulatory directors seem to be completely, it's completely irrelevant what the public wants in their own community. And what they discovered is that the history of the regulatory arena of law started in the 1880s when the Attorney General of the United States met privately with the executives of the railroad corporations, 1880s, which were the first giant corporations of our country. And the large railroad corporations were causing significant harm to people and to the landscape that they were passing through. And at that time, corporate harm, believe it or not, was prohibited by their charters. Corporate charters said that each corporation was to serve one specific social need and to cause no harm. And the Industrial Revolution period of the mid to late 1800s created a whole different kind of economic development. And it was very clear to the industrial leaders that they had to figure out a way to get from prohibiting corporate harm to regulating corporate harm. That was a major shift in the culture and the politics and the reality of the United States at the time, from prohibiting corporate harm to regulating corporate harm. That happened in the late 1800s. So in the 1880s, the railroad industry met with the Attorney General, and they created what was the first regulatory agency in U.S. history. It was called the Interstate Commerce Commission. And it was basically designed to look like a bold response to public outrage against the railroads, but in fact it was designed to tie the public up in knots and make them as irrelevant as possible in their own situation. Here's a couple of quotes. The Attorney General, Richard Olney at the time, explained to railroad corporation executives that this new agency was, quote, to be a sort of barrier between the railroad corporations and the people, unquote. Said Charles Adams, president of Union Pacific Railroad, seeing what was needed to solve the railroad corporation's problems, quote, what is desired is something having a good sound but quite harmless, which will impress the popular mind with the idea that a great deal is being done, when in reality very little is intended to be done. That was the regulatory system. The public was to be pacified with laws that sounded tough, but placed much discretion in the hands of regulators. And the system worked so well to frustrate the public, to challenge the harms caused by railroad corporations, that one industry after another then demanded its own regulatory agency. So when we look at the regulatory agencies in the present day, be they the Hawaii Department of Agriculture, the USDA, Hawaii Department of Health, the National Labor Relations Board, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Departments of Forestry at the state and federal level, all of these agencies come out of an extraordinary history that we don't really understand. Although I think we understand it in our gut, because they seem to pretty much ignore the will of the people. And it's not that the will of the people is being ignored because the agencies have been captured by large corporations. For example, I hear all the time, Monsanto, I hear activist group leaders say, Monsanto Corporation has seized control of the USDA, for example. And the sad truth is, it's actually a pretty scary truth, is that the regulatory system of law is a corporate system of law. And it has been since the 1880s. That you can't expect to get justice for your community through the regulatory system, because regulatory law is written with the active participation of the industries being regulated. Regulatory directors, agency directors, frequently are in revolving door with the industries that they regulate. So the whole regulatory system is corporate territory. It's not a seized system. It was designed to work the way it works, and it works very, very well, thank you, for its purpose. So the farmers are experiencing this in the flesh with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And they're really stunned, and they go back to their community because they can't get what they want from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They go back to their community and they say to public interest environmental attorneys that are working with them on this application to try to get it declined, why can't we protect our own community? Why is it that there's nowhere we can go in the state to get the permit application denied? What is going on here? We thought that the sovereign people have authority to protect the health and welfare of their community. And these public interest attorneys explained to them that there are 3 structures of law in this country that are hidden in plain sight. And this is really important for folks to understand. And that these 3 structures of law make it literally illegal for a local government, a city or town or county government, to pass a law that prohibits a corporation from harming you in your own community. It's illegal because of these structures of law for a local government to pass a law that prohibits that corporate activity that would automatically, inevitably create that corporate harm. And here are the 3 structures of law. And it's really important that we, the people of this country, understand these structures. And I'm not telling you conspiracy theory here. This stuff is out there. Just look it up. It's right there. It's not hard to find. The first one is called state preemption. And I'll bet a whole bunch of you have heard of state preemption, because the lawsuit that's currently active with Kauai and Maui and Hawaii counties all involve challenging corporate harms and being told by judges, I'm sorry, you can't. What you're trying to do is preempted by the state. State preemption in this specific case, in this specific situation, is easy to explain. If the state regulates a corporate activity, a local government is not allowed to prohibit that corporate activity. It's that straightforward. So if the state of Hawaii regulates GMO agriculture, or regulates factory farms, or regulates clear cutting, or regulates oil trains on the tracks, or regulates big box stores, if there's a state agency or a federal agency that regulates, i.e. allows that corporate activity, a local government is not allowed to prohibit that corporate activity because of state preemption. On the flip side of state preemption, kind of the flip side of the same coin, is something called Dillon's Rule, D-I-L-L-O-N''S, Dillon's Rule. And Dillon, full name John Forrest Dillon, 2 R's in Forrest, John Forrest Dillon, was a late 1800s state Supreme Court judge in Iowa. And because he was an elite individual, he was a state Supreme Court judge, he had a particular idea about government. And he started integrating this idea into his court decisions, and it came to be known as Dillon's Rule. And his idea was incorporated by the U.S. Supreme Court starting in the early 1900s. Dillon's Rule says, in so many words, that the proper relationship between state government and local government is that of parent to child. That obviously the state is the parent, the local is the child, and what that means is that the state government has all the authority, and the local government only has the authority granted to it by the state government. That the local government is a mere tenant of the state, said John Forrest Dillon. That the state gets to decide what kinds of lawmaking a local government can make and what kinds of lawmaking it has no authority to make. So generally, in terms of corporate activity, the local government has almost no authority. It's allowed to do zoning, and some local governments try to use zoning to prohibit a corporate activity. But zoning isn't about prohibition. It's not about saying no, it's about saying where, right? Yes to this site, no to that site. And so some local governments think they're very clever by zoning corporate activity completely out of the county. And they're frequently sued, and they usually lose. Because zoning is not about prohibiting, it's about deciding where it goes. Other than zoning and nuisance law, which is your neighbor has a junked car in the front yard collecting rats and is refusing to deal with it, let's say, that's a nuisance activity that is usually complaint-based. Those are about the only 2 things that local governments tend to have authority over when it comes to corporate activity. So that's Dillon's Rule. And if you've ever wondered how did it come to be that the Michigan government is able to dissolve city councils in the state of Michigan and replace them with emergency managers appointed by the governor, they can do that because of this law, because of Dillon's Rule. That Dillon's Rule recognizes that the local government is a mere subdivision of the state, that it doesn't have its own integral authority, right? Does that make sense? right? It's just a subdivision. Now, there was another guy, Thomas Cooley, who was also a state judge in the late 1800s. He was a constitutional law scholar. And he firmly believed, Cooley believed, that the authority of local government comes directly from the people who live there. Well, that idea has gone down the memory hole. And Dillon's rule has come to serve us as the ruling structure. And there are about half of the states in the United States are Dillon's rule states, and Hawaii, tragically, is one of those states. So that's flip sides of the same coin. State preemption says what the states legalize and regulate, a local government can't prohibit. Flip side of the coin, Dillon's rule says the local government only has the authority to pass laws in the areas of operation the state allows it to. Okay? And then we come to the third structure of law, and it's called corporate constitutional rights. And I put up this really interesting timeline on the wall here, this big banner, is a timeline of corporations being granted constitutional rights for 196 years by the U.S. Supreme Court. The legislatures have never granted rights to corporations. Our presidents, our governors have never granted rights to corporations. It's all entirely through the courts, mostly the U.S. Supreme Court, occasionally a state Supreme Court. 200 years, 196 years of corporations being granted constitutional rights and protections by the courts, which is really an outrage if you think about it, because corporations are just legal fictions. That's one of the descriptions of them. They're not people. They're not living beings. Corporations are merely business structures, right? And a legal fiction is a term that's used because they're legal. They exist under law, but they're a fiction in reality. In other words, if I asked you to take a picture of Monsanto Corporation, you actually couldn't do that. You could take a picture of its buildings, its headquarters, its directors, its agricultural fields, but the Monsanto Corporation legal fiction, it doesn't exist in the material world. It's a business structure that exists in our minds. Just like government is a legal fiction. It's a concept that exists in our minds. So imagine how crazy it is to grant constitutional rights to something that doesn't even exist in the material world. So over the last 196 years, and I'll give you a couple of examples, corporations have won property rights, they've won free speech rights, they've won religious freedom rights, they've won rights against search and seizure, they've won right to a jury trial, they've won privacy rights, they've won access to a number of clauses in the Constitution. A couple of crazy examples. In the 1960s, during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you try to stop a cell phone tower in your community, has anybody tried to do that on Kauai? I bet somebody has. If you try to do that, you're going to run right up against something called the 1996 Telecommunications Act that was passed by the federal government. And in the Telecommunications Act, it says that a local government does not have the authority to consider the human health impacts of a cell phone tower placement in their community, because that would violate a corporation's civil rights, as if corporations were oppressed black people. I'm not making this up. Right? Civil rights protections for corporations. The reason that we can't limit money in politics by corporations is because of a 1976 Supreme Court decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, that opened the floodgates of corporate money and equated for the first time the right to speak with the right to give unlimited amounts of money. It's called the money equals speech decision by activist communities in 1976. The reason that the labeling, if you've ever looked at the labeling of a dairy product that says does not contain, this dairy product is bovine growth hormone free. I bet some of you have seen that on labels, on dairy labels. Well, the Vermont legislature in 1996 tried to pass a law that required the labeling of bovine growth hormone in products sold in Vermont. And the companies that used bovine growth hormone in their milk, in their dairies, sued and went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that you couldn't require this product contains bovine growth hormone on the label because that would violate a corporation's right to not speak, which is a subsidiary right, they argued, of the corporation's right to speak, which is a free speech right of a corporate person. So, I mean, the stories are really extraordinary. There's a book on the table. I have a bunch of books and literature, free handouts and books priced as marked. And there's a book on the table called Gaveling Down the Rabble that I have a couple copies left of. And it's all about corporations winning constitutional rights. And it's really an extraordinary story. So coming back to the farmers in rural Pennsylvania, they learned about these three structures of law from the activist attorneys, the public interest attorneys in Pennsylvania. And they were absolutely stunned. And they finally understood this is why we can't pass a law in our community, because it's going to be challenged by all of these bizarre structures of law that we consider unjust and illegitimate because they violate our rights. And the farmers said to these public interest attorneys in 1999, okay, well, so we can't do it because it's going to be legally challenged, but what if we do it anyway? What if we pass a law that bans factory farm? What's the worst that's going to happen? Well, the attorneys said to the farmers, you're welcome to ask us to draft a law to ban factory farms in your community. But you have to understand that that law would violate corporate constitutional rights, Dillon's rule, and state preemption. But we're happy to do it for you, if that's what you want. They wrote it. It was passed unanimously by the Township Council of Wells in 1999, and it banned factory farms. And the most amazing thing happened. The application was pulled from the table at the Department of Agriculture by the large factory farm corporation. They didn't sue, they just pulled the application. And that was the beginning of the community rights movement. And to fast forward just for a few minutes to get us to the present in the community rights movement, 20 more rural conservative communities in Pennsylvania then passed pretty much identical ordinances trying also to stop corporate factory farms from moving in. 2 communities in rural Maine passed ordinances to ban corporations bottling water, sucking up groundwater and putting it in little bottles for sale around the world. That was banned in Maine in 2 communities. Communities in Pennsylvania also banned corporate dumping of urban sewage sludge onto rural farmland in their counties. And then about 5 years ago, we had this extraordinary shift in what the community rights movement was doing. It went from simple bans, simple local bans, to being much more a sense of not just what we're trying to stop, but what is our grander vision for what we want? What kind of community do we want to be creating for ourselves and our children and grandchildren in the future? And so it went from prohibition-based ordinances to rights-based ordinances. And it began with the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania City Council passing 7-0 about 5 years ago, the Right to Water and Self-Government Ordinance, which was an ordinance that banned fracking. It recognized for the first time that all of the living beings, both people and nature, that were alive in the city of Pittsburgh had the right to water, and that fracking had to be banned in Pittsburgh because it violated everyone's right to water. And that became kind of the model and the template for the community rights movement starting about 5 years ago. And ever since then, the movement has really just exploded across the United States. There are now 200 communities in 9 states that have passed community rights ordinances. And each community rights ordinance includes 3 pretty extraordinary elements. Each ordinance bans a particular harmful corporate activity that is normally considered legal, like a factory farm of dairy cows, right? It's completely legal and regulated, but the community doesn't want it. So rather than trying to regulate that harm, which is what we're used to in this country, a community would prohibit that specific corporate activity. That's the first one. It enshrines the inherent right of a local community to protect its health and welfare, regardless of what the state says, that if it wants to increase its environmental protection, in its own local lawmaking, it nullifies the state's authority over it through state preemption and Dillon's rule. It says, if you don't let us increase our environmental protection because of Dillon's rule and state preemption, we're going to nullify the enforceability of those two state structures of law within our community, within the boundaries of our community. So in other words, it says we're not going to recognize state preemption and Dillon's rule if they violate our right to protect our own health and welfare. And the third thing is it strips that sector of corporations of all of their so-called constitutional rights. So every ordinance does these three things. Bans a particular corporate activity, enshrines the right of self-government locally, which again is not such a radical idea. We had it for the first 10 years or so in the United States. And it strips that sector of corporations of their constitutional rights. And so what I find really as you can imagine, this is a pretty big culture shift for a community to pass an ordinance like this. And because these laws challenge these existing structures of law, as you can imagine, there may be lawsuits against local communities. And what's been really striking is that of the 200 communities in 9 states, 95% of the communities have never yet been legally challenged. They haven't been sued by the corporation or by the state. So that's approximately 190 of 200 communities were not sued, which means 190 communities stopped the corporate harm before it ever arrived in the community. That's really quite extraordinary. See, where was I going to go next? I'm almost finished. It's so funny how fickle the brain is. It's like you're on a roll, and then all of a sudden something happens in your brain, and it's just blank. That's definitely one direction I could take this. That wasn't quite where I was headed, but I'm going to get there sooner or later anyway, so I will go there next. Thank you, Alicia. So yes, of course, you may wonder, why are so few lawsuits? Because these are challenging structures of law that lawyers have not challenged, communities have not challenged in a very long time. If there are lawyers in the room, you probably know that the stuff that I've mentioned is considered settled law, that activist attorneys don't even bother challenging this stuff. It's usually thrown out as a frivolous legal challenge in a courtroom. But what's so interesting is that when you step out of the regulatory framework and into what we call rights-based lawmaking, you're in a real paradigm shift moment there in the culture of your community. I just remembered what I was going to say, so I'll finish this and see if I can hold both thoughts at once. Minds are so funny. And so what happens is that these are communities that have decided culturally in their shift from being afraid of being sued to taking on these historic structures of law, that they've gotten less afraid of being sued than they are afraid of losing the health and welfare of the community. In other words, the fact the farmers, for example, in Wells Township got to the point culturally where they couldn't imagine allowing a 15,000 head factory farm into their community. Right, just the incredible ecological destruction, just the way that people were living, right? It was like, this is not our vision for the future of our children and grandchildren. And so right now we're in a point in our culture where local communities are terrified of being sued. But what would it look like if we went through a culture shift around that? And we said, look, what's most important to us is that the health and welfare of our community is protected. And if we're going to be joining up with 200 other communities in 9 states and challenging these structures of law that violate our right of self-government, that violate our right to protect our health and welfare, why does that have to be so scary? Does that make sense? right? But that's not where we are normally. Normally, a local government, when they find out, and I'm sure Gary can probably tell stories about this, that if the government is threatened with a lawsuit, frequently at that point the local government says, okay, well, we're not going to even do that. We're not even going to consider it, right? Because a corporation is going to sue us, right? So we have to get to the point, and they have in these 200 communities, where they're more afraid of losing their quality of life than they are of being sued. And the ordinances themselves are designed in such a way to force a really different kind of lawsuit. As I said, we're stepping out of corporate turf, which is the regulatory arena of law, and into rights-based turf that is no longer corporate. So corporate attorneys can no longer sue with their eyes closed, half asleep, right? They actually have to think about the argument that they would have to make in a court of law, which says that the corporation has more constitutionally protected rights than the people who live in that community. Now, scarily enough, that's accurate. They do, under current law. Corporations have more constitutionally protected rights than you do. It's one thing for you to hear it from me, but imagine if in your county courthouse a year from now you've already passed one of our ordinances, and a corporate attorney is forced to say in your county courthouse, the people of Kauai County's constitutional rights don't matter. All that matters here, Judge, is that the corporation has constitutional rights. Can you imagine? That's not somewhere a corporate attorney really wants to go when a community is mobilized. So that's one of the main reasons that our ordinances have not been sued yet. I want to just kind of sum up. Let's see. Oh, I know the one thing I wanted to close with. I got a little bit sidetracked this evening, which I haven't done in previous evenings. Is I wanted to tie this directly to the Kauai Ordinance number 2491 that's being challenged in the courts. So Kauai County in 2013 passed Ordinance 2491 that required that Dow, Syngenta, BASF, DuPont Pioneer disclose their pesticide use, their genetic engineer crop coverage, and establish pesticide-free buffer zones near public areas, schools, hospitals, and waterways. I looked at the lawsuit by these corporations against the Kauai Ordinance, and it's really interesting. These structures of law that are hidden in plain sight, you actually don't have to go very far to find corporations using these exact structures in their arguments. They have to, because that's actually how they have rights over you. So right in the first 6 or 8 pages, I found 3 very relevant pieces. The corporations claim that the Kauai Ordinance violates their federal and state, this is a quote, their federal and state constitutional rights to equal protection and due process. That's the 14th Amendment that was written to turn black men who were slaves into black men who were citizens. That's the 14th Amendment, equal process, equal protection and due process. But corporations want equal protection and due process under the 14th Amendment in an 1886 Supreme Court decision, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company. It's when corporations won personhood for the first time. And so here they are arguing basically their rights under the 14th Amendment as corporate persons. So imagine if we started understanding that corporations can't have constitutional rights and that the state can't be allowed to preempt our authority to protect ourselves if we're actually going to have healthy communities. Here's another one. The ordinance, quote, takes their property without compensation, unquote. So that's a takings. And the takings come from property rights. And property rights are, again, a right in the Constitution for people, not for corporations legitimately. So here they're claiming their corporate property rights. And finally, the claim by the corporations in the lawsuit, they say that Kauai is a mere subdivision of the state and therefore does not have the authority to have passed this ordinance in the first place. And there's Dillon's rule. Okay? So I've come to this community invited by Friends of Mahalapu to introduce you to a whole different paradigm of thinking about how you protect the health and welfare of your community. And our work is very nonpartisan. We are mostly rural, conservative-led communities in the community rights movement. But progressives and Greens are also very, very active. Libertarians are leading in many communities. And I just want to encourage you to imagine that rather than tackling with having to put tens of thousands, I'm guessing, of hours you're going to end up putting into this one project to stop one dairy farm, imagine if you started putting your effort and your money, your hard-earned money, into a political process that actually takes back your self-governing authority at the county level and starts protecting under law your own community bill of rights that you write and that you enforce directly. Thank you very much.